I'm Andrew Copson, and my day job is being the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, and I'm also currently President of Humanists International, which is the international umbrella body for humanists and similar organisations. But I've been invited here today to talk about this book on secularism. And I'll do that for a little while, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion about it, because I know that a room full of skeptics and humanists is also a room full of opinions and comments just waiting to spring forth, and some of them have question marks at the end of them sometimes, and they're the most enjoyable part. Maybe we ought to do that afterwards, otherwise, I don't know, I just sort of, you're beautiful to contemplate, but I think that, what do you think? Otherwise I might feel like I need to help you or something. Okay, and this book, Secularism, which takes 2 hours and 43 minutes on average to read, was commissioned for the very short introduction series for, I hate to say it given my location, Oxford University Press. Yes. I'm sure you'll get a press one day in Cambridge as well. And this is what's called bringing the audience with you. By Oxford University Press, for a little series that you might know called the Very Short Introduction Series. So, you know, it's little paperback books, a very short introduction to archaeology, Egyptology, atheism, humanism, religion, everything under the sun. And they wanted to commission a volume on secularism, and they asked if I would do it, and I said yes. And the reason that I said yes is that, well, two reasons really. Firstly, I think that secularism is a concept that is under threat in today's world, just like almost every other concept that is foundational to the liberal political order, just like human rights are under threat, just like the rule of law is under threat, just like democracy itself, liberal democracy, parliamentary democracy, is under threat. I think secularism is similarly under threat everywhere, almost everywhere. But unlike those other liberal political concepts, secularism isn't very loudly defended. It has its defenders, and many of us in our day jobs try and be the most stalwart defenders of this principle that we can, but it doesn't have defenders on anything like the scale that we see in international human rights campaigns, for example, that try and push back the opposition to human rights. And that means that secularism is in a double bind. It's under threat from religious extremists, ethnic nationalists, political conservatives, all the same people who are opposing other aspects of the liberal political order. And also, even worse, it doesn't have the strong defenders that those concepts have. And why doesn't it have those strong defenders? Well, I think in part it's because there is a lack of knowledge about what secularism is, where it comes from, how important it is, how foundational it is, especially to free societies, to Western states, but also, as we'll discuss perhaps, in other parts of the world too. And unbelievable though it might be, this book is, since it came out, the only single volume introduction in English to secularism that there is. So that's how under-published about, how under-known it is. Certainly you could do a politics A-level whilst never encountering it. You could do politics undergraduate, maybe not at this university, but at some universities, like Oxford, I'll get you back on side. Inferior universities where you would never perhaps encounter secularism, except maybe as a footnote to liberalism or in some way if you chose to study it, but you wouldn't necessarily encounter it. So it is unknown. So that, I think, appealed to me. And to write a book about it in a series that is all about being an introduction, a sort of balanced, level-headed, hopefully objective introduction to the topic rather than a polemic, appealed to me as well, because I figured that way maybe more people who don't know anything about it will read it, rather than just being a polemic, as it were, for the converted. So that's why I wrote it, and then they decided to bring out a hardback in advance of the paperback. But don't let the fact that it's coming out in a cheaper paperback version in a long time in the future deter you from also obtaining this one, because this one's got all the mistakes in it, and that's much more interesting. You don't want to just get the expurgated paperback version. So when they got the manuscript, they decided to bring it out in hardback too. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about secularism. 2 hours and 43 minutes it takes to read the book. As I said, it would take obviously much longer to read it aloud, so I can't possibly cover all the contents of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about secularism, what it is, a few of the countries that I look at in the book where there are secular states, because it's quite interesting to look at different types of secularism. You know, the secularism of France, America, Turkey and India are all very different from each other, so I'll dwell a little bit on that. And then maybe just to ginger things up a bit at the end, I'll talk about some of the arguments against secularism. We weren't expecting that. But in a book that has to serve as an introduction, hopefully objective, to the topic, there's a chapter about the arguments in favour of secularism, which I won't dwell on because you all probably believe them and know them already, but also a chapter on the arguments against secularism, which the humanist philosopher Simon Blackburn, who I think is a Cambridge person, said was far too kind on the arguments against secularism and ought to have been harder on them, and the Catholic Herald said was just a load of straw men. So somewhere between the twin, not that Simon Blackburn is extreme, somewhere between these twin positions of the Catholic Herald and Simon Blackburn forms the truth about the arguments against secularism chapter, which I'll discuss. So secularism, first of all, what is it? Well, it's important to ask that question because the word secularism has been used, like almost every word, of course, in hundreds of different ways since it was first coined. It was first coined by the English social activist George Jacob Holyoake, who, when he coined it, meant it to describe any non-religious approach to matters of society, matters of morals, matters of politics, matters that human in the social world, in the human world. And he hoped that this thing that he called secularism could be a sort of common ground for religious and non-religious people around which they could cohere. Laying aside their differences about any other worlds that might exist, he thought that if we focused on this world that at least we all know exists, or we're pretty certain does, and that we share and that we have to make the most of, this worldly attitude might bring us together. And he called this sort of attitude secularism. And that word is still used in a very loose, broad way by some people, though a minority now in UK English, by a slightly greater number of people in the US English market. These days, the instances of secularism in UK and international English are far more likely to be about something rather narrower than Holyoake's broad original meaning. They're far more likely to be about a particular approach to politics, to the ordering of states and laws and nations and communities. And it's that secularism, that approach to a political situation that this book is about. Now, even within that slightly narrower meaning of secularism, there are many, many definitions. And so because it's a short book, I had to pick just one, and I used the definition, a sort of synthesised definition given by the French political scientist Barbaro. And he said that secularism has 3 parts. Firstly, there's the separation of religious institutions from the institutions of the state. So a secular state is one in which those 2 sets of institutions are separate and they don't dominate each other. They don't try and control, well, they may try to, but they don't actually end up controlling each other, interfering with each other. That's the first aspect of secularism, and that's one that we're, I think, instinctively quite familiar with when we think about secular states. Second aspect of secularism, according to Barbaro, is that a secular state is one that seeks to maximise, for everyone, the freedom of thought, conscience, religion and belief. Now, it can't give everyone all the freedoms that they want all the time, because in any shared society, my freedom has to be sometimes limited in the interest of the rights and freedoms of others or of other social concerns. But as far as is possible within those limits, the secular state, according to Barbaro, will try and maximise freedom of conscience, thought, belief, for not just for its citizens actually, but for everyone within its borders. And that's the second aspect of secularism. And the third aspect of secularism for Barbaro is that the state, the secular state, will treat people equally and not discriminate against them or privilege them on the grounds of their religion or belief. So it won't, purely on the grounds of your religion or non-religious worldview, discriminate against you as opposed to another person within the state who is not of that belief or is of a different belief. And Barbaro's definition, I think, is a good one because it's a true description of what most self-declared secularist activists in the world today, in this sort of campaigning world today, would say that they want. It's quite a good umbrella for the various different academic definitions that exist of secularism, although not all of them, because of course academics being academics, maybe I should be careful again given where I am, there may be some of you of that kidney in the audience. But academics being academics, they love to proliferate definitions and argue about them and chop them up into little pieces and dissect them further and further. But Barbro's definition does work quite well as an umbrella over those academic definitions that does exist. It also represents pretty accurately what states that in their own laws and constitutions declare themselves secular are broadly meaning by doing that. So it covers the campaigner's definition, it covers more or less the academic's definition, it covers more or less the definitions of states, and it's also quite true to the historical development of secularism. The separation of religious institutions from state institutions is really the first thing that we see in the history of the development of secularism. And human rights, the freedom of thought and conscience, is the second stage of the development of secularism, if you want, in the 18th and 19th century, and of course the great human rights instruments of the early 20th. And equal treatment is almost the third step on the development of secularism. Only really in the last 50 or 60 years, and really accelerating quite recently, has it become a part of the secular state's interest to actively seek equality and equal treatment on these grounds, not just freedom from constraint on these grounds. And the European Union, of course, has been the greatest engine of that, with things like its equality directives on grounds of religion and belief. So Barbro's definition, I think, is a good one, at least to start with, on that basis. So there is a chapter in the book that looks at different definitions of secularism, but I won't dwell on it now. I'll turn instead to give a sort of brief description for comparative purposes of the real-life secularisms from the 4 countries that I chose. And it's very hard, actually, to, in a short book, decide which countries I was going to hold up as the best exemplars for secularism. And you may have your own favourites, which perhaps we can share later, and you can claim should have had a chapter of their own. But I decided to choose 2 from the Western world, broadly defined, and 2 from the rest of the world. Most secular states actually are outside the Western world, interestingly, in constitutional terms, though how far their secularity is reflected in real-life policy is different from the question of whether they're secular in their constitutions by law. However, 2 from the West and 2 from the rest. And I suppose we should start with the one that everyone thinks of when they're invited to consider a secular state, which is France. How many people, if I said, name one secular state, would have instantly said France? I think almost everybody. How many people would have said America? Interesting. Oh yes, almost many. Okay, well we'll get to it. Okay, I like this game. How many would have said Turkey? Old school, no longer true. Okay, and how many would have said India? Almost no one, though India is perhaps one of the 5 people. India is perhaps one of the most interesting examples of secular states we'll come to. So I start with France. And the reason I chose France and America and Turkey and India is because they all have an approximation to Barbro's definition of secularism. They all have claims to be secular states, but they're all slightly different from each other. All their secularisms are also, as well as being sort of approaches to the ideal, they're also heavily conditioned by the history of the countries in which they're instituted, the religious demography of the countries in which they're instituted, the time in history, in world history, I mean, at which they became constitutional, and many other factors. France, of course, is very well known. So French secularism springs, in theory, at least, from the European Enlightenment. There are ancient antecedents to secularism in Europe, which I talk about very briefly in the book, but they needn't concern us here. We'll start where people erroneously think all secularism begins, which is not true, but for the moment we'll start here in the European Enlightenment. French secularism very much springs from the ideas of the European Enlightenment, and very specifically the idea that the Enlightenment philosophers share, and like present-day academics they didn't agree on much. But some things they did agree on, and one of the things they did agree on is that in matters of government, authority for a government came not down from God through king, but derived its authority instead from the consent of the governed. Different ideas about it, but broadly they, I think, would agree on that concept. And applied to the question of religion and the state, that gave us a sort of theoretical secularism in the works of many Enlightenment philosophers. And France was a place, the revolution of which took these ideas seriously. So the French Revolution, which of course is not just a single event, but a decade-long series of political innovations and events, started with a declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, which included a guarantee of freedom of thought and opinion. They're desperate to be used, but they're not going to get it. No. They can't fight back. They can. They've completely wiped what I was saying. What was I saying? French? France? Yes, thank you. Yes, Declaration of Rights. And contained a guarantee of freedom of thought and opinion for all people, including, the word including in matters of religion. So, in pre-revolutionary France, alongside the monarch, and almost as totalitarian and controlling and oppressive, was the institution of the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was the first estate after the monarch. It was the largest landowner in France. Its clergy and office holders had all sorts of peculiar legal privileges and rights to get just after the monarch in precedence. A bit like England today, actually. If you want to, in a lesser way, if you want to watch a big public ceremony like the cenotaph, for example, who is it that follows the members of the royal family first in order of precedence, away from the cenotaph back into the Foreign Office? It's not the elected politicians, it's not even members of the House of Lords, it is of course the bishops. They are next in order. And if anyone else is speaking in the House of Lords, for example, and a bishop stands up to make their point, everyone else has to sit down, you know. This is still real, I know, outrageous. Apart from one great person, Baroness Massey of Darwin, Doreen Massey, a Labour peer, a member of the Parliamentary Humanist group, who said, was speaking, and the bishop stood up, and people said, "Bishop, bishop, bishop," you know, which is what they say when another speaker is so rude as not to sit down. And she said, "I can see him," and she just carried on. But anyway, that's a digression. So the Catholic Church was enormously powerful, enormously influential. And so was the equal target of the anger of the revolutionaries together with the crown. And so although the French Revolution does begin with this lofty declaration of the rights of all people to freedom of thought and opinion, even in religious matters, it has also from the beginning a profoundly anti-clerical character. And it doesn't take long for those lofty ideals to be swept away. So there are lynchings of priests, there are burnings of churches, and in the de-Christianization of French society that revolutionary governments try and achieve, there is what can justifiably, I think, with hindsight, be called a persecution, and a real persecution of Christians, not like the ones that some people allege in the UK today, for example, about not being able to wear a cross to work, or not being able to tell lesbian children that they'll go to hell or whatever. Not that sort of persecution, but an actual persecution of Christians. And the French Revolutionary government, you know, arrested the Pope, which was all very jolly until he died in prison. And there was all sorts of persecution of Christians that went along with the revolution. Napoleon really put a stop to it, and at that point, although he didn't roll back on the legalization of divorce and the emancipation of Jews and the curbing of the legal power of the Catholic Church, he did, when he became eventually Emperor of the French, put a stop to persecution of Christians and try and set a new model of religion-state relations for France that he, in the way of all dictators, thought would be eternal. It didn't last, of course. Napoleon, a great man, and Britain was wrong to make war against him, discuss. But at least Jews who were emancipated by the armies of Napoleon had to wait a long time before there was anyone who was going to try and do that for them again. However, and the British state didn't do it, I can tell you that, when they re-invaded. However, this is not the time to refight those wars. Napoleon instituted a new system for dealing with churches. He introduced a ministry of religious affairs and sort of regulated religion, but kept freedom of religion for everyone. This Ministry of Religious Affairs recognised not just the Catholic Church, but also the Lutheran Church, a denomination for Jews, and so on and so forth. Throughout the 19th century, Napoleon was wrong, this wasn't the final answer to this problem. Throughout the 19th century, there's a sort of, this is summing it up, there's a sort of tug of war between those secularist, usually Republican-minded, leftist elements in French society and politics, and the monarchical, often Catholic elements in French society, pulling this way and that way politically. But in the end, at the end of the 19th century, as you know, France, in the age of the Third Republic, becomes a secular state again. Divorce is reintroduced. I don't know if you were French in the 19th century. We were sort of married one minute, divorced the next, and bigamist when the divorce was legalised and delegalised and so on and so forth. I don't know. But divorce was made legal again. Religions were swept out of things like public schools, health boards, and so on and so forth. And then in 1905, a final law was passed on the separation of religion from the state, and that 1905 law is written into the current French constitution, as is the text of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So France today, whichever republic it is now that they're on, I don't know, I can't remember the number, fifth, thank you very much, the Fifth Republic, there'll be another one along in a minute. The Fifth Republic has those secularist principles written in to its constitution. And apart from some late 20th century debates about the funding of Catholic schools and education, secular education, French secularism seemed remarkably settled, until recently, of course, when controversy has boiled back up, particularly about French Muslims, and how traditions of French secularism bear unfairly or not upon them and upon other French citizens and others within France of minority religions. But how does French secularism hold up to Barbier's ideal, Barbier's French, of course? I think pretty well. There is a separation of religious and state institutions. There are laws seeking to maximise, in the model of the original Declaration, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. And those laws operate quite often very well. They don't always operate well, of course. The burqa ban, which may have different views in this audience, I don't know, but I have a strong opinion that the French government was not right to bring in a law that banned the burqa in public places. The burqa ban is an example, perhaps, of that. But French secularism often works very well in a way that we don't get to hear of. If you remember the burkini bans, burkinis, which are just wetsuits with good marketing, really, which some Muslim women wanted to wear to obey religious rules about covering yourself up in public, and various mayors in the south of France and inland as well, where you've got some National Front mayors who, even though there wasn't a beach in sight, they were going to ban the burkini too, and they banned it. Various mayors banned it, and of course we saw in the English-speaking press all about it, and it was widely, especially in the sort of Guardian type of press, widely held out as an example of how wicked French secularism is in bearing down on religious minorities. But of course these women went to court. The bans were challenged, and French secular law applied to this question found in favour of those women who wanted to wear the bikini, because they weren't interfering with anyone else's freedom, and their freedom of religion had it that they should be permitted to wear those things. So that wasn't so covered in the Guardian type press. Afterwards as that, and there's a Guardian reader. Okay. So, I suspect there's quite a lot of them actually. Not that many. Apart from that, though, French secularism, I think, does hold up pretty well, and the generally equal treatment. So I think that France does pretty well. But it does have, carried over really from its origin, this anti-clerical, and some would say now anti-religious flavour. I won't put it any more strongly than that. It has a certain flavour. And when President Chirac was justifying the headscarf ban in public schools, he used a phrase which became notorious afterwards. He said, that this ban was justified because schools should be safe places for children. And the implication was clear. Religion is trying to get at you, it's trying to get at you all the time, and the role of the state, the role of the secular state, is to protect you from it. So there's something in French secularism, encoded into its DNA really, that means that French secularism is about, fundamentally, however it might match up to Barbara's ideal definition, French secularism is fundamentally about protecting people from religion. The state does that for people. And you might think a very good thing too, but it's just worth pointing out as being distinctive of this secularism. Quite different in flavour, of course, is the secularism of the United States. And again, this partly has to do with its origin, because when secularism is written into the constitutional law of the new country that becomes the United States of America, it is not, the revolution that leads to this change is not, as a result, primarily of religious oppression, although there are some grievances to do with denominational freedom. It's much more about, as we all know, political and economic argument, and the revolution is about that. And the approach to secularism is therefore in the context of a much wider idea that's abroad in the American Revolution of freedom, of liberty. When, for the first United States Constitution, is a secular constitution in at least one respect, in that it prohibits any discrimination in public office on religious grounds. So unlike in the Britain of the time, when you had to be an Anglican to do anything really, certainly enter Parliament, but also go to university, or be a servant in the Crown, be any public office. You did for some time after the American Revolution as well. That went on for a long time. But unlike the situation that then pertained in Britain, in the American Constitution from the beginning, you couldn't have a religious test applied to you if you wanted to serve in public office. And then with the First Amendment to the Constitution, which came about when a large number of the founders of the United States thought that the first Constitution inadequately protected fundamental freedoms, in the First Amendment then to the Constitution, it was mandated that Congress could make no law regarding the establishment of a religion. So the Constitution became even more secular in that it made it clear that the American Republic would never have an established religion. And that Congress could also make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So Congress could also make no law prohibiting freedom of religion. So from the very beginning, the secularism of the United States was a secularism of freedom of religion. And if French secularism was about protecting you from churches that were trying to get at you, then American secularism was much more about protecting your church from the state and making space for your freedom of conscience. And that was in keeping with many trends in that revolution. And Jefferson is really the ideal figure here in terms of a progenitor of American secularism. It was all about liberty, it was all about freedom, it was all about conscience. And that's the US Constitution. Again, as in France, this was heavily contested throughout the 19th century. And Christian lobby groups were very quickly formed in the early 19th century to oppose God not being in the Constitution. And God in the Constitution was a movement throughout the 19th century where lobbying Congress to amend the Constitution so that either Jesus, but more often just a God, a nice non-denominational God, you see, so it wasn't really establishment, it was just the God that everyone believed in, that God should be put into the Constitution. The sort of people who were horrified when Jefferson was elected president, these Christian lobby groups were very strong, and although they didn't achieve their constitutional amendment, they did have some victories along the way. In the late 19th century, they were able to have "In God We Trust" written onto the paper currency, and then onto the metal currency. In the mid-20th century, of course, "One Nation Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So there has been some erosion of American secularism along the way. But largely, unlike in France, American secularism was protected and given its unique character not through politics but through the courts. And the Supreme Court, in attempting to uphold free exercise, although there's some pendulum in this throughout the ages, depending on the facts of the case, has provided American secularism with a much greater consistency than French secularism had. Now, American secularism today is, I think, despite appearances, quite resilient, and will certainly endure for longer, I think, than the political trends that currently assail it. We'll discuss that too, perhaps. in a moment. And again, American secularism matches up to Balboa's definition very well. I'd probably go further actually and say that America is probably the most secular state ever to have existed in the world. And today, certainly the place where you could probably have the greatest freedom of religion and belief, perhaps to the significant detriment of other people. However, I think that is true. So, French and American secularism being the most interesting examples in the West, I then had to find two examples outside the West. And first of all, I chose Turkey, even though I was very unhappy with doing so. But I felt I couldn't not address Turkey, because it is, if I were to ask the question not what's the first secular state you can think of, but what's the first secular state outside of the West you can think of, I think a lot more hands would have gone up for Turkey than for India, I'm guessing. Turkish secularism, quite different from American and French secularism in many, many ways, but certainly different in its origin, and one of the most obvious differences perhaps is that it is not a secularism desired from below, but is very much a secularism imposed from above. Mustafa Kemal later had the honorific Ataturk and is known by that name, so that's what I'll call him, whether he deserves it or not is up to you. Ataturk, who was president of the Turkish Republic that succeeded the Ottoman Empire, abolished the caliphate, took the Islamic declaration out of the Republican constitution, secularised public education, secularised public health, went further actually than secularising the state and closed down just civil society groups that we would think of as civil society, religious groups, secularised the army, secularised the universities, and so on and so forth. But it wasn't necessarily popular. And one of the earliest rebellions against the infant Turkish Republic was a religious rebellion. It was organised on religious grounds by people who didn't want to see this secularism. Now, Ataturk was very clear. He was personally probably a non-believer as well, maybe quite a strident non-religious person, probably. But far more than that, he thought that secularism was the only modern way to be. He wanted a Turkey that could compete industrially, economically, militarily with Europe, the Europe that had so shamed and then disintegrated the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's predecessor. And so, because he wanted a modern state, he wanted a secular one, because he was most inspired by France, and he thought that secular was modern, and secular would mean success. He was never elected president, of course. There was no democratic, or not by a democratic mandate at least, in his lifetime. And the moment that the Turkish electorate has a say, that second half of the 20th century pattern in Turkish politics becomes clear, which is that Turkey can have democracy or secularism, but it can't really have both. Because the moment that people can vote, they don't vote for secularist, westernised parties by majority, and government becomes more and more Islamist until, in the past at least, the military have a coup. The military are very secular because they're a sort of elite group. The military have a coup, reimpose secularism and various aspects of the constitution, and then, a few years later, they open up to democracy again, and the Turkish people slowly elect more and more residents, and the whole thing happens again. Until most recently, of course, when the military coup did not succeed, and we are being filmed, so I won't say that I think it should have. We are being filmed, aren't we? Well, I wouldn't say that anyway, obviously. Military coups are bad. Don't organise a military coup. But I know how I felt when I watched the BBC News late at night of seeing what was going on in Turkey. So until recently, this pattern was clear. Recently, of course, it's become very clear that Turkey's future, at least in the short term, is probably a good deal more Islamist, certainly than Ataturk would have wanted, and perhaps than most of us would like to see. So, Turkish secularism, people speak of it, and they speak today of its decline, and people are right to speak of its decline because it certainly has very few political supporters these days. The Speaker of the Turkish Parliament said that if the Turkish constitution were written today, it would be an Islamic state. That's pretty clear where his allegiances lie, at least. But I think it's also a bad example of secularism because I don't think the Turkish state really ever was secular. If we accept Balboa's definition, and I think we should, of the secular state being not just one that separates religion state institutions, but one that seeks to maximise freedom and treat people equally. Well, the Turkish state never tries to treat people equally on the basis of their religion or belief. And although its constitution contained declarations for protection of freedom of thought, confirmation, it also has a very poor history, even in its secular times, of doing that. But it doesn't even have actual separation between religious and state institutions, because although Ataturk cleared religion out from state institutions, he parked the state's tanks very firmly on the lawns of religious institutions. And the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Turkey today, as it always did since the time of Ataturk, licenses the mosques, trains the imams, licenses the imams, accredits them, and civil servants write the sermons that are delivered in authorised government mosques. So there's no separation, really, in the Turkish state. There's control of one religion, in particular the main mainstream denomination of Islam that most Turks belong to, of one religion by the state. And although public institutions like schools and universities are secularised, religious organisations don't have their own freedom. So Turkey, forget it, but I had to talk about it. The final secular state is India in the book. And India is of enormous interest to everyone who thinks about secularism today, because it seems to them to offer a new model of secularism for Europe. What distinguishes, and the reason is, because what distinguishes Indian secularism is that it is a secularism that has had to cope from the beginning with hyper-diversity, a massively plural society. India, even in ancient times, was characterised in spiritual terms by diversity. Of course, there are Buddhists now, and Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs and Christians and Humanists and Muslims and Jews and everything else in India. And then there are Hindus, but there are hundreds of thousands of different types of Hindu. And almost every Hindu could be an individual religion in their own right, which is why you can never really have faith schools in India, one in every home. It just wouldn't work. But that has meant that India, even 2,500 years ago, was in some parts quite pioneering in terms of a sort of nascent or quasi-secularism. And some of the earliest writings on politics that we have from classical India advice to princes on how to keep the priests at a sufficient distance, how to make sure that they're not interfering, and to keep your policy pure from them. And we get, for example, from the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, decrees on religious freedom that are far ahead of anything that the European human rights tradition produced. So India, and there are also, of course, terrible oppressions and persecutions and religious laws, and the soil of India is drenched with no less blood than the soil of Europe on these grounds. But there are also other ways of thinking that modern Indians can look back at, and certainly have provided the background conditions, at least, for Indian secularism today. The colonial state also coloured the secularism of India. The British state in India was not much concerned with religion. It had one aim, really, which was just extracting the maximum value out of India as quickly as possible before anyone noticed, and certainly before they had to leave. And that was its aim. And actually, in doing so, it was quite advantageous to the British state, and the British state did follow through on this, to behave in quite a secular manner. And it governed in quite a secular manner. Distinctively so. I mean, it didn't, for example, introduce one civil law for all Indians. It treated Indians differently based on religion. It allowed Muslims to have their family law, Hindus to have their family law, and so on, and so Zoroastrians to have their family law, and so on and so forth, and to have those laws administered by separate jurists from those religions. But it didn't seek to impose one religion on everybody else. The Indian independence movement, of course, was very secular, drawing, as it had to try to do, Indians of many different beliefs into its movement for the shared aim of political freedom. So all of these are the background conditions of Indian secularism, and From the beginning, the Indian constitution is secular. It becomes, the word secularism is added in the 1970s, but from the beginning it's a secular constitution in all of its principles. But if French secularism is about protecting people from religion and American secularism is about protecting religion from the state, then Indian secularism is interesting primarily because it's about protecting everyone from everybody else. It's very much the secularism of diversity, the secularism of the state trying to mediate between different individuals and groups. And as a result, in India, the state, unlike in America, doesn't necessarily hold itself back from religious controversy either. You know, the secular state in India accepts that for prescribed public purposes, like, for example, the elimination of caste discrimination. The state might intervene itself in religious affairs in order to right a social wrong. So for all those sorts of reasons, because it's a sort of activist state, at least in theory, and also because of the diversity of the population, the Indian secularism has become a sort of, object of interest to Western secularists as well. Well, the last few minutes then before, do we have a break or do we go straight to questions?
We'll have a break.
Have a break? Yeah, we'll need one. It's a lot to take in. I'm only hearing it now myself for the first time. I used to have slides, to tell me what to do, but it's all just pictures. I actually don't know what it is. We'll look at them later. Arguments against secularism then, I'll do that's quick. So I'm assuming that all the arguments in favour of secularism are well known to you. Secularists say that secularism is the best way to promote human freedom. Of course it is, because if your choices are limited and prescribed by the state, you can't really flourish, grow in every direction that you might want to grow in. Secularism is the only way to achieve fairness in the state and justice, because if your life chances or political ambitions or education or whatever it might be, moral choices are impaired or limited by a religious state that doesn't share, whose beliefs you don't share, how can that society be fair? Secularism, secularists say, is the best way, the only way, of achieving equal citizenship and genuine democracy, because if some citizens are of the same religion as the establishment, how can the citizens who are not of that ever feel that they're equal citizens and participants in one political culture, which of course democracy entails. And secularists will also commonly say that secularism is the best way to guarantee peace. Look what happens when the state takes a side in religious conflict. It doesn't necessarily have to be wars and bloodshed that we're talking about, as I said a moment ago, that have occurred all over the world when religion has taken, when states have taken a side in religious conflict. It can be just everyday injustices and inequalities which create a sort of civil dis-ease, the lack of social cohesion and peace. All of those arguments would be shared and made by secularists almost anywhere and at almost any time. So Nehru in India, Jefferson in the US, Ataturk, at least in what he would say, in Turkey, the French revolutionaries and so on and so forth, they'd all broadly sign up to those arguments. Maybe people like Nehru and Ataturk in the 20th century would add the argument for modernity as well, and they'd say, secularism is the only way to be modern. But certainly they would all agree with those first sets of arguments. The arguments against secularism are much more diverse, not at all of the same set. Now the first, and obviously the oldest, is also the most ridiculous, which is the theocratic argument against secularism, right? I have been told by God, or, at least secondhand, that this is the way to be, these are the things to do, rules have been laid out for how I should behave, but also, therefore, how society should be ordered. It's all there, written down, perfectly clear, let's just apply it. And there have been Christian theocracies of that sort, of course, in the past. Today, most states that take that approach are Islamic states. And the best, by which I mean the worst, most recent restatement of the theocratic case is Ayatollah Khomeini, of blessed memory, pamphlet of 1972, Islamic Government, when he basically says that. He says, why bother with discussion, debate on the laws of men. You've got the Quran and the Hadith. All you need to do is apply it, and it contains everything: laws, morals, codes. He says, when he gets into power, as anyone who studied the history of Iran knows, he finds that's not quite true, and he has to wing it a little bit from every now and again, and sometimes do things that might not be in the Quran or Hadith. But the principle is well expressed by him in that pamphlet, helpfully translated into almost every language in the world by the government of Iran, so you can read it online for free. Books that are free are not worth reading, of course. That's the just in case. As you know. So that's a silly argument. You're not going to believe that unless you already believe in one of the monotheisms, and of course most monotheists don't believe that argument either. Most religious believers don't think that theocracy is the best government for us. So you can put that to one side. In those states that are not Islamic states today, take a Christian state like England or the UK in a different way, a different sort of argument against secularism has developed, which is not in favour, as it were, of a full-blown theocracy, but does make arguments in favour of an established church. And in the book, actually, I think I use the Church of England as an example of this, because the Church of England is one whose ways I know best in terms of how they argue this. And the argument runs pretty much like this. It says, a secular state is fundamentally unsympathetic to people's deepest convictions, especially when people's deepest convictions are religious. And we, in a historically Christian West, are lucky to have established churches, especially in England, which has a very fine, remember I'm in character here, has a very fine established church, which means that when immigrants come to this country, who are often Muslim, they feel very much at home. Because although the established church is not their religion, they know that religion is taken seriously. And this is fundamental not just for for them, for people of minority religions. It's true of everyone, because the Church of England nurtures all. and some they've got some good arguments, because often they'll say things like, look at Turkey, a secular state, look how badly people are treated. Turkey's a secular state, England is a Christian one, where would you rather live? They would never say it that bluntly, but that's often what they mean. There's some good points there that you might want to argue with. I'm not going to argue against these arguments against secularism, apart from one, because it's one that I'll say at the end that really annoys me. I'll just leave them there for you to look at and see what might be wrong with them. Queen Elizabeth II, God bless her, does a good line in this sort of argument. You can read one of her speeches, and whoever wrote it was very keen on this, and she says those words willingly, I'm sure. So she's a good case study. There's another argument. I mean, the established church people aren't theocrats. They've got a different sort of argument against secularism. There's a third argument of this type, which in the book I called a sort of romantic conservative argument, and that's the best phrase I could find to capture it, which is not theocratic, and not necessarily even in favour of an established religion, but says that is one that's also built around, like the established church argument, an idea that secularism isn't quite natural, it's not quite sympathetic, to how people are. And if you think about someone like Edmund Burke, in the 18th century in England, a great conservative political thinker, or if you think about the Hindu nationalists in power in India today, these are the two, I think, best examples of this idea of romantic conservatism. Now, secularists, being generally Enlightenment-minded people in their political theory, if they're conscious of it or not, are people who think generally that states are convenient arrangements, that we're together as individuals, trying to be rational, or maybe not, but often being rational, and we have a sort of social contract which we can sign up to, and the state is a structure to allow us to live with each other. But not everyone, of course, sees society in that way, and not everyone sees political politics in that way. Some people think the state is something quite different, some people think the community is something quite different. Someone like Edmund Burke sees it not as an artificial structure, but as an organic one, as a tradition, as a set of values, as an ethnicity almost, which moves through time. And the people today who are part of England and Englishness are only just as important, as the people who came before us or the people who will come after us. What's important is that we are this organic tradition moving through time. And that sort of romantic conservatism, to distinguish it from other sorts of conservatism which might be more pragmatic, that romantic conservatism, of course, is often ranged against secularism, because if you have that sort of view of identity of a people, you very often think that that people has a religion. Burke wasn't a theocrat. He didn't want everyone to be members of the Church of England all around the world. He actually wrote that that Mohammedanism, Islam, was right for Arabs, and that Indians should be Hindus, and that French should be Catholic, and not godless revolutionaries like they were being. But people in England ought to be Anglicans. So it wasn't that he was a theocrat, he was something subtly different. He believed in the people, blood and soil, if you want to think of it that way. And the current Hindu nationalists governing India are the same type of person, at least intellectually, as that. So there are three arguments, I think three sets of arguments, which are quite easy to see the problems with. There are other arguments that are less so, and I'll finish with two of those. I cover more arguments against secularism in this in the book, but I think these two are the most interesting. The penultimate one is I think I call it the multiculturalist argument. I think I do, I can't remember actually. It's bad. But we could easily call it that. So the multiculturalist argument against secularism is one that says, look, talk about individuals, talk about their rights and freedoms, but people are not just individuals. People only exist in relationship with each other, and those relationships are very important. And the groups that people form on the basis of those relationships and shared identities are very important. It's becoming more tenuous, as you can see. And religions are a very important example of that sort of group or identity, and therefore the proper foundation for the state is not the freedom of individuals that secularism would like to seek to maximise, but instead the cohesion of groups within each other and then together, and that the building blocks of society should be communities. A community of communities, that's what I call it. I don't call it multiculturalism, I call it a community of communities, because I think multiculturalism is a word that triggers a lot of people one way or another, and they might like it and therefore they don't like what I've said, or they might not like it and therefore they really like what I've said but for the wrong reasons. And so a community of communities is what I call this argument in the book. Some secular states actually have this to some extent. India, as I said a moment ago, you might be thinking there's actually some aspects of this approach in the secularism of India, and I think that's right. It's also, though, the sort of approach that gives us, for example, the growth of faith schools, state-funded faith schools in England, and many other wrong-headed policies on this basis. So, this is a very neutral book. I don't say that in there. I don't say wrong-headed, but occasionally just bursts out from the heart. I love faith schools, really. Okay, and then the last argument against faith schools, I was going to say. The last argument against secularism, I think, is the trickiest. And it's an argument that comes often from pretty secular people themselves. A lot of academics, a lot of sociologists, again, apologies. My own mother is a sociologist, so I can say it, it's fine. It's not anti-sociologist if I say it. She's told me I can say it. Many sociologists have this problem. Many political scientists and Western liberals, it's a sort of Western liberal argument really, against secularism. And the phrase I use to describe it in the book is a phrase that many people use when they're making the arguments, which is the myth of neutrality. So these often secular opponents of secularism say, look, you secularists, right, you claim that your approach to government and to politics and to law is neutral, is impartial. It's not. It's anything but. It's drenched in values, it's full of values, it's full of prejudices, it's full of assumptions. It's the product of the West, bearing all the hallmarks of Judeo-Christian, they like the phrase Judeo-Christian, these people, bearing all the hallmarks of Judeo-Christian values and then humanist Enlightenment values as the West, proceeds. And these unshared assumptions and these unshared values mean that secularism, though it might be suitable for white Westerners, is unsuitable for a lot of other people, and its claim to be the best political settlement to cope with diversity in particular is flawed. Now, people who make this argument sometimes make it at a big level. They say things like, the public-private distinction is a Western one, and that other political cultures or societies don't have that same distinction, don't sustain it. Or, say for example, you might say that a school is a public institution in a public space because it's funded by the community and it's a place where people come together. I might say, from some other culture, I'm still in character here, I might say from some other culture that the school is a private place, even though it's state provided, because it's the place where parents send their children to be educated on what could be more intimate than the decisions of the parent and the education of a child over which the parent should have influence and so on and so forth. Many, many different inflections of that. On a smaller level as well, these same critics of secularism make the point, and they, away from the big concepts of political philosophy, say things like, oh, marriage law is a good one, marriage law is the best one, right? So this is a real-life example from the early days of American secularism. So as I said, the American Constitution guaranteed the free exercise of religion for all people, no ifs, no buts in the Constitution. Who were the first people to test this law? Mormons. Mormon men convicted of bigamy because they had married a number of women, and a number of women had married them, just to be clear. And they were convicted of the crime that existed of bigamy, and they went to court and said, my constitutional rights have been violated, the Constitution gives me free exercise of my religion says you better marry a lot of women, my wife's religion agrees, and yet you have sought to impose on me, the state has sought to impose on me its Protestant idea of marriage as being, one man, one woman. How is that fair? How is it secular? How is it right? And the court says sort of, well, no, but they don't make an argument on principle at all. They sort of introduce a novel sort of argument in their judgment that says, well, what would happen if everyone did it? More or less, that's what they say, and they skirt the question of free exercise of religion. But isn't the Mormon right, actually? And aren't the Muslims in India, Muslim men mostly, in India, who resist the imposition of one marriage law across India? It's currently, there's a different marriage law for Muslims than there is for other Indians, which allows, for example, polygamy. And the people who resist that, the Muslim resistance against this imposition of one marriage law, say, well, who are you, to impose your Hindu marriage norms on me as a Muslim? And this is hard. This is a hard question for secularists to answer. An example from closer to home, in Northern Ireland, the Baker case, the gay wedding cake, whatever. It was quite popular to have a go at secularism when the bakers had a judgment against them for refusing to bake a cake with, celebrating gay marriage. And people said, look, why is the secular law forcing norms on these Christians? So, that's a real problem for secularism as well. Thank you very much. No, don't worry, no. I'm going to go a little bit further. Now. Because I think it's an important argument to counter. But I like your almost Pavlovian applause reaction. You're very polite people. You didn't even stop to think about, you all want to drink? All right, okay. Didn't even stop to think about whether I said it was good or not. Okay, I like you. Unthinking, clapping is the best. Okay, so There are ways to answer this argument, I think. First of all, if you think of something like the bakery case in Northern Ireland, it isn't really secularism that is doing the work in the successful suing of that baker. The state has decided to pursue as a goal equal treatment for lesbian and gay people, and so the baker has been caught by that. It's not, just secularism has come in and told them what to do. It's a policy decision of the state. Harder in the cases of marriage in the 19th century in the US, perhaps, but today the justification for laws against polygamy is largely constructed in terms of the human rights of women or the human rights of children. So again, other concerns, not secularity, but other policy concerns being brought into play. However, I do think, although I value secularism as a political approach for positive reasons, for example, that it maximises human freedom genuinely and allows us to grow as individuals, I think that in some cases, and this is one of them, you also have to be prepared to admit that secularism isn't perfect. Nothing is perfect, as we know. There will never be perfection. Sorry to let you down if you thought that this was it. In this world, but secularism is better than the alternatives. That's the argument I think that you have to make against this particular argument against secularism. But you may have other responses to it too. If you do, please do make them more comments, and they'll go into the paperback. And now let's have that drink. Thank you very much.